please make sure to turn off your camera and microphone unless you're a speaker. Otherwise, we will. To improve the quality of your experience, we would suggest turning off gallery view and activating hide non-video participants on your video settings. So you want to click next to the arrow on the camera and it'll give you a better view of the panel. We'll be doing this more or less in a similar way that we've done it the past 2 weeks. That for those of you that have participated, it will be short panel discussion followed by some interactive Q&A, and both you can provide both questions, answers, and ideas as well. And so to make this efficient, please use the chat screen to make your questions, comments. For the past few weeks, it's been a very rich dialogue also on the chat, so we would encourage you, everybody who's participating, also to, as we go along here, if you have ideas, go back and forth, exchange thoughts. I think it provides a rich combo for everybody. This will be the third webinar we've done, and I guess the third and final for the moment. The first week we heard from Palladium and Volta on the Ukrainian Impact Bond and the Impact Bond Innovation Fund. Last week we had a wonderful discussion with Cooperación Inversor and Fundación Corona, Village Enterprise, and BNP Paribas. And this week we'll be hearing from Shaun Conway and Sowmya from Grey Matters, India. Following this webinar, we'll be coming back to you guys with some potential options on ways to take this forward and this may include some potential subgroups and action groups to some pure learning options, as well as if there's interest and demand, we could potentially do another series of these types of webinar discussions based on people's interests. So we'll be doing a little bit of polling today during the webinar, and may send out some information afterwards. Also, we'll have a digital or a virtual note taker today, as we've had in the past 2 weeks. Riley, maybe just before we get started, you want to show everybody your screen, and then we can follow it.
Yep, will do.
Great. Thanks, Riley. So over the last 2 weeks, we've heard from outcomes-based finance practitioners on the challenges they've been facing. And I think what we've already known and what we've heard is that COVID-19 has really shed light on many of these inefficiencies in the traditional aid and humanitarian funding systems. And one takeaway that I've had from much of this is that going forward, there's going to be a need to do much more with much less, and that our existing systems in ways, many ways lack capacity, the reach, and means to respond. Some of our discussions we've heard about how things like in-person outcomes verification has become much less feasible. Remote delivery of services, when and if feasible, have their challenges and sometimes limitations. And both of these limitations are suggesting a need for more rapid technology enablement to help us better organize, better incentivize, better impact. And so this community, without a doubt, the outcomes-based finance community, is much more forward-looking maybe than others towards frontier and emerging technologies. We're a community that has in our DNA this idea of adaptive management mindset. And I think this is evidenced by how many of these projects are already starting to rapidly adapt in ways that maybe traditional aid projects may not be. We've heard from many of our colleagues around ways we're experimenting with virtual solutions to keep services going. Yet the reality is that with all of this, many challenges abound. And while we have in this community very much a digital bent, I would argue we're still operating in a sector that is still struggling to break of the legacies of the 20th century and an analog mindset in how we operate. And so a key theme that we've heard over the past few weeks has been this question of how to build greater adaptability and greater flexibility into these mechanisms. And COVID-19 perhaps is a opportunity or gives us permission to accelerate our thinking around smarter ways of funding impact. And so with that, I'm very excited about today's discussion, and I'd like to welcome our speakers. Our my good friend Shaun Conway from ICSO Foundation. Shaun is a medical doctor, a global health and development expert turned technologist who is the founder of an open source software foundation called the ICSO Foundation. For those of you that know Shaun, he's definitely a thought leader on the development and application of frontier technologies, including Web3 data technologies and blockchains for impact. Also, I'd like to welcome Sowmya from Grey Matters India. Sowmya is the CEO of Grey Matters, which is a leading educational assessment and analytics organization in India. Grey Matters is also the outcomes assessor of the Quality Education India Impact Bond, or DIB, which also includes stakeholders such as UBS Optimus Foundation, DFID, I believe the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, and British Asian Trust. So I'd like to maybe give my first questions to Sowmya. Sowmya, you're the evaluator of the Quality Education DIB in India, which education is a sector which, and particularly from an outcomes-based financing mindset, has clearly been disrupted from schools closing early. Being a part of an industry where it's still very much in an analog mindset, and how has what's going on with the Quality Education DIB influence your potential thinking towards what does it mean to start to transition towards a more digital future? And how do you see this transition happening?
Sure. Thanks, Zach. Thanks for the introduction and the question. Hello, everyone. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, whichever part of the world. So like Zach mentioned, we are, Grey Matters India is the outcome assessor for the Quality Education India DIB. And the QEI DIB actually impacts around 100,000 children across India. So there was complexities when we were getting into the DIB. There were a lot of complexities, and I'm sure many of you have been party to that in the different DIBs that you've been working with. But the assessment perspective is one layer additional complexity that comes in, like from just the design, specifically in education, because we're not measuring a direct variable, we're measuring a latent variable as it is called. There are also multiple interventions within this DIB, right? So there are 5 different types of interventions. And India being a complex country, these are spread across geographies. And also the whole newness of the DIB and everything. It took us 8 months from the design complexity side to have this designed. And then comes the layer of implementation complexity. Again, I'm sure most of you are aware, but just in the context of this DIB, what that has meant for us as an assessor is that we are assessing hundreds of schools in a single day. We have invigilators because this is a high stake testing scenario. There are physical papers going to these schools. Someone's carrying them, conducting these assessments, bringing them back. So if you try to envision the logistical complexity of it, one, of course, there is that whole cost effectiveness, cost inefficiencies that come, but also amount of control you can have over a process like that. But there is also reality, which is the lack of infrastructure or a device access or an internet access, which kind of didn't allow us to push the bar at that point of time. But when we designed it, like I said, it took us 8 months to contract and another almost 2-3 months to get into implementation, because these complexities in the analog world are pretty significant. And that was before COVID came in. So in that, even at that point, we realized that we needed something more efficient and more effective that would allow us to transition this fully analog system, even if slowly, into a digital world, at least eliminating some of the inefficiencies that we are seeing. And on that front, what we had explored is conducting assessments using digital devices. So these were tabs that someone still had to take to the school, but they would largely function offline, so the data could be collected without a lot of complexity in terms of papers and marking and all of those things. So we were piloting these models, and we got to scale in our other projects. Another additional element that comes in assessing something like a DIB, in whatever context, is that the assessments are high stake and the probability of a malpractice always is a big one, and having to cover for that using digital mechanisms. It was something that we're still figuring out, and we had piloted a few ideas like using a camera on the app and things like that, but still a very nascent place we were in. And now that COVID happened, it's like an acceleration into what do we do now? Because from an implementation side, our partners, service providers have quickly moved into doing whatever possible in a digital way, right? I mean, they're using WhatsApp heavily. Despite the access issues and the availability of device issues, that allows the learning habit to continue. And truthfully speaking, the second year QEI results were so phenomenal. We had kids almost being 1 year academic year ahead of their learning. But now they've lost 6 months, or rather they've been on a break for 6 months, and it's not a regular break. There is both emotional and financial distress in these families when they come back to school. And also the fact that many of them may not come back to school. Now, when they come back to school, we still need to go back and assess them. And if we are not looking at technology even more revolutionarily than we did before COVID hit, we're going to start at a blank, because we really don't know what the learning loss is in the last 6 months due to all the different things that are happening. And we are at this moment looking at using, again, a WhatsApp-based system to do a dipstick assessment. It does not solve for controlled environment we create when we are assessing for a dip, for outcomes and rewards, but it still allows us to understand the learning loss so far. And that's our current transition. And we're still, I mean, of course, like for everyone else, there are more questions than answers at this point. But some of the conversations we've been having with Shaun, and I'm sure Zach will also introduce Shaun, and he will get into the details, I think will take much more life at this point of time of accelerating this transition from the analog to the digital world.
Thanks, Sowmya. And you talked, just a quick follow-up question, and you talked and used the word transition. And for an organization like yours, I mean, what does that transition really look like, and how, is it a easy one, and how do you see that, how do you bridge that, and how should it evolve?
Yeah, I think two parts to that, Zach. So one is some of us, we knew the digital transition was happening and it would have to come. And we were just didn't expect it to happen this fast. So what we are doing is accelerating the things that we were already doing. But when it comes to service providers in India, the ones that we were working with, we're still in the traditional mode of going to schools. I think the transition to digital has been a bit more abrupt for them, but also exacerbated by the Indian context where transition to digital has a last mile problem, right? In the sense that there is one device in a family and may not have a device which can be used by a child. And also many of these kids are very young. That's another issue. So the transition more from an organizational standpoint can be difficult for those who've not really started ramping maybe 2 years back. But everyone is at it right now. Everyone is trying something or the other. Everyone is experimenting, and the innovation is just great to watch. And we will only know what's going to happen out of that maybe 6 months down the lane. But what is still the bigger problem, bigger challenge, and remains so and will actually worsen due to COVID is that last mile problem, because even houses that had 2 devices no longer have that many devices, right? And those who had internet are not able to pay for their internet. So that problem just gets worse. So that transition is accelerated, yet has too many barriers to cross, basically. Does that answer your question?
Great, thank you. So maybe let me kick this to Shaun. So Shaun, just hearing what Sowmya said and just reflecting a little bit, how do you see COVID-19 potentially influencing the rate of and nature of kind of digital adoption. In many ways, in the ways that many of us here right now are working remotely, working via Zoom. And what does that look like, particularly from a lens of outcomes-based financing, which is, I think, the focus of this conversation. How do you see this?
Yeah, thanks. So I think that the acceleration is obviously one aspect of it, but we really have an opportunity to think about like what systems is this changing. So if we take the analogy of the world of work, where people have moved very quickly into remote work. The whole system of work is changing, and the system of how we conduct seminars has changed. And it's not so much just about using a specific tool. It's a whole business model. It's a whole economic model. It's a whole social model. And so I think that this is a really great opportunity to accelerate a bunch of technological shifts, which are systems level shifts. And so, Zach, I've got a few slides that I think may just help to illustrate a couple of these points. So when we talk about these shifts, we can conceptualize them both in terms of the system. So this is not just about implementing some apps. This is about the information system, the communication system, the economic system, social system, etc. And all of these can have technological innovations, and doing that in the context. And so Sowmya has explained the context really eloquently. And what we're talking about here is moving from an analog system to a digital system, which is kind of where most people have a zone of familiarity. But beyond this, we have an opportunity to move into a cybernetic system. And we have examples, very, very good examples of cybernetic mechanisms, whether that's unmanned flying drones or self-driving cars and these kinds of things, which are really about sense and respond. So sensing what's happening in the environment and responding, and providing a much more granular and much more rapid feedback loop that enables us to be much more responsive, or enable the mechanism to be much more responsive. And in the context of development, an idea I've been working on, I guess it comes from my sort of health training background, is that what we're really building out here is a digital immune system for humanity. And that's a very big statement, but it's essentially a new kind of internet, which enables us to have stateful data. So we can record the state of the world at points in time and define future achievable states that we can configure the systems towards, and create incentives to reach those future states. Now, we couldn't do this 5 years ago. We couldn't even do it 2 years ago, because we didn't have the data systems and the technologies that would make it possible. And so, really, I think the opportunity here is to rethink about kind of like, what is the game that we're playing here? What's the system? How do we configure it? And how do we make this work for the new paradigms, the new contexts? And so, just to be sort of more specific about it, when we're implementing analog systems, these are generally information poor. So they're systems where the level of resolution, so these dots actually you could represent schools, for instance, so 1,000 schools, and each dot is a school, and the level of resolution to the to what's going on in those schools, down to the individual learner who is the recipient of the intervention and then taking the tests and so on. The fidelity and the resolution of this is very low within analog systems, and so they're quite information poor, very difficult to really quantify the risks. And I would say that there's a quite low correlation with kind of reality. And so if we look at how this is implemented within a verification system, you'll have a baseline, which is based on doing randomized sampling within a very large sample, and then a follow-up, which essentially does, again, randomized sampling and measures a change, which is an average. So from an average of or a mean score on the educational assessments at the beginning to a mean score towards the end. So these are kind of shades of gray kind of things. And this is an example of a class filling out the GMI assessments just outside of Delhi last year. Sowmya, I don't know if you want to sort of add anything at this point, before I talk a little bit about the digital interventions that we've been working with.
Yeah, so this is a typical classroom. This was in Delhi, and so you see the test papers that are there. Those are the instruments that are used for the children to kind of mark out their answers. And yes, I don't have much to add, but what we were experimenting at this point is comparing the performance on the paper with a tab-based assessment. And so this was last year, and the concerns were one of the key concerns for the service providers was, would kids be really okay with using tabs? Will their performance go down because they are not used to assessments on tabs? On the contrary, what we found was extremely exciting. Shaun, you want to show the next one where they have the tabs, maybe?
Yeah.
Do you have? Yeah. So anyway, so what happened was these kids are actually, and this is, like I said, in the DIP context, we've not done tab-based assessment significantly because the measure and there is a lot more controlled nature to that measurement. But in our other settings, we do use tab-based assessments at scale. There is this enthusiasm and excitement in kids when a tab, because they are handling an electronic device for themselves, probably for the first time, and they're very, very quick. So we have a few practice to get into the system for sure, but there is a natural learning and a very quick one at that curve that they come to get to the assessment and answer them at pretty much the same level at which they do answer a paper-based test. I have a question here that says, what do you mean by tab-based assessment? So essentially, a typical test of ours has 30 questions on a paper. It is multiple choice questions that are there, and the child marks the answer that they think is the right answer on the paper. We collect the papers, and that's the analog model. What we've done in the tab-based is basically these tabs are owned by us. We take them to the schools when we are conducting the assessment. These tabs have an app that we've developed. The app works offline. So, but it has those same 30 questions on the tab, on the app. So once the child logs in with their name and ID, which usually is done by the teacher in this, they're able to see the questions. And just like they would, instead of marking, they pick an option A, B by pressing it and keep moving through questions. And at the end, when they submit it, the responses just stay on the tab, but then we bring it connected to the internet because the schools typically don't have internet. And when it connects back to the internet, the responses are synced into our system where the analysis gets done. So that's the explanation for the tab. Hope that answers your question. Yeah. Shaun, anything I missed? You can add in.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so so if we think then about the shift to digital systems and we think beyond the applications and the devices, really this is an opportunity for us to get an entirely different class of information. I like to refer to this as high definition data, so higher resolution. So if you're having digital identifiers, particularly if they're implemented using the new web standards, the World Wide Web Consortium W3C standards of privacy preserving digital identifiers, you can start to get a high level of resolution around these identifiers of different data points. If you're capturing the data within the format of cryptographically secured data objects. So in the case of our field testing with GMI last year, we were actually capturing the results on the tab into an application which encrypts and hashes and signs the data objects. And so from the service interface, you're collecting data objects that cannot be corrupted anywhere else in the system. These are information rich in terms of the way that the data is collected. Particularly, you'll see on the right-hand side here a picture of a graph, and graph data is really important in this context. So being able to create a link between all the different data points with the new data standards, linked data standards, and so on, when you get down to sort of the technicalities of how these systems can be configured, you're able to get a really sort of high definition picture of what's going on, both at a point in time and over time. And then when you record that within a blockchain record, which is essentially creating a state. You can record that state in a stateful way, which enables you to compare changes over time and look at the chain of attribution or the chain of contribution backwards and forwards. And so within a system like this, you have a lot more information available to quantify risks and just by definition, a higher level of correlation with reality. And so when we conceptualize this in the context of doing evaluations and verification.
Sorry, that was me. Can I just contrast what you said about fidelity to what happens now? If you can just, so this can remain. What happens in the current scenario is we fidelity, but what happens with the fidelity, achieving that fidelity is it's extremely cost intensive and logistic intensive. That's what I was trying to explain in the beginning. So in the analog model, we can achieve fidelity, but it comes at a lot greater effort and a lot greater cost. And having a system that is systematically digital, and I think I would want to use that, stealing Shaun's thought process there, not just a single app or a single system there allows. So as I was explaining, what's happening right now is we are having a person watch over the students, and then we take the data back and then we run a pattern check algorithm. Because again, these are high stake measurements and all that. And then this data is manually entered into a system. So there are many layers of fidelity issues, risks that rise, which can be avoided use a technology system at a much lower cost. And that's the value of moving to the technological system, basically.
Great.
So, go.
Yeah. So when you've got high definition data, you've got these data nodes with the edges, so a graph with nodes and edges, so everything is related, and you can get a higher level of resolution, particularly if you're able to do this on a more systematic basis. And so conceptualize this as now kind of every school being covered rather than a randomized sample. If we can get the testing technology to be more scalable, quicker, cheaper, and more valuable in terms of the data that it collects, the data itself has value. And so now when you're comparing results over time, it's really taking an integral of a whole lot of data and being able to come up with risk measures or a prediction on the likelihood of that outcome having been achieved. And this raises a whole lot of kind of methodological questions as well, which I think link back to part of the discussion last week about counterfactual data and whether you need to have controls and so all of the things that make a more analog system more expensive. If you start to apply data science innovations to how the data gets collected and measured and predictions are put in terms of machine learning and so on, you get a completely different sort of class of application in terms of what can be achieved. And then add to that, if you're moving into a direction of a fully digital or at least digitally enabled education systems, for instance, you're able to collect a lot more signals throughout that whole system. And so a pilot which we will be implementing together with GMI and UBS Optimus Foundation involves an India-based NGO, Chimple, that has an educational application which collects real-time data on the levels of achievement within the educational game that the children are engaging with. I mean, this is one of the examples of in the context of COVID, we're currently having discussions about whether to shift that pilot from being a school-based program to actually looking at this as a potentially as a home-based learning program. And that then just opens up a whole lot of questions around, okay, well, how would you do these assessments, which GMI traditionally does coming in at an individual school level, and how would you then conduct those in a household kind of context? And of course, all the questions around inventory control on devices and how do you pay for the devices and so on. And this is why the systems perspective on this, looking at economy, looking at society and so on, is really important. And I believe we have a direction of progress towards making this feasible and real using the technologies. Sowmya, do you want to add anything to that whilst I'll just leave this to you? just kind of show, oops.
Yeah, I think, sorry, just there's a question here, but before that, I'll just add to your point, Shaun. Again, integrated thinking to technology, which I think now is getting accelerated for all solution providers. They have to have that. It's not an option anymore. There is an absolute need to have a technological element, and that in turn means that there is data. So for example, like I said, a lot of our service providers in the DIB and outside the DIB are extensively using WhatsApp, because that's kind of the most widely app in the segment that we are working in. But they're also realizing that the amount of engagement data that they're getting is actually way richer. And before they didn't know what was happening with a video or a test that they were doing was not collated. They are appreciating the richness, and like I said, it's accelerating movement to technology and also appreciating the need for a technology-based system and not just in parts, basically. And Chimple is probably a great that. And Shaun, before you move on, there's a question here about, so the question is about Educate Girls DIB and the internal performance management system. So at this point, Celeste, just to be clear, the current QE is not designed to have a technology element. It is a fully analog. Everything is pilots, so that in the next DIB that we do design, we're able to cover for both the design and that a large DIB presents. Yeah, the digital approach will not cover, is the concern that you're raising with the Educate Girls DIB. That's a design issue. I think it's more from how do you set the right targets and set the right metrics. So I don't think it's a technology element to cover for that particular thing. Right?
So one of the kind of really important features of technology based systems is the data. You know, so if we think about pretty much all of the technologies that are that are becoming available, whether it's a self-driving car or drones or whatever, they all really are data technologies. That's what I mean. They are material science and things like that, but it's really about the data. And so, you know, if we also just think of the value of the data in the context of verification mechanisms that are collecting data, but really mostly using that data for verification purposes, rather than, for instance, using it as a diagnostic or using it to do personalization of the curriculum or prediction and so on. And so when we collect data in these new systems that is high definition data, that is verified and good quality, it then provides us with the substrate to be able to do all of these kind of P functions, which is kind of data science driven servicing of the data. So whether it's around prediction or personalization and so on, it opens up a whole lot of space for innovation to improve the underlying project delivery. So the effectiveness of the intervention. And so we really move from, you know, in the analog system, bringing more digitization in creates some efficiencies. And so we may get sort of marginal increases in cost to outcomes. Then as we get more data available, we get increases in the effectiveness. So we now get, you know, effectiveness gains that might be multiple times more than just those marginal increases in efficiency, which make the program itself worth more. So in terms of the outcomes that are achieved, and therefore the investment in using digital verification mechanisms is not only about getting the verification done, it's also about improving what you can achieve in the program. And I think, Sowmya, you know, your organization is very much driven towards kind of data-informed, data-driven education, and so this is very much kind of on your roadmap. Am I right?
Yeah. So again, I just want to help. I know Shaun is giving what the outcomes looks like, but I think most of you maybe have experienced an education intervention, or and you to help you envision how that happens. essentially, it's not just claims. And there's also a question on how much does it take to get to predictive analytics. So we assess over 1 million students a year, right? So that's the extent of data that we are collecting. Last year, we assessed over 2 million students. And we have data points that link to their geography, to so much of the personal data. But what happens is when data is integrated, it's an iterative loop. So many of the projects, even in the DIB and other projects, is that the feedback goes into the system and loops back as an action in the program. And when we start collecting that data, now we do a baseline and end line, like Shaun was mentioning. We do it at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year. Now imagine if you could collect data and iterate on a bi-monthly basis, your design, your pedagogy, your instruction, whatever it is that you're taking. So integrating data collection using digital mechanisms becomes a lot easier, and it allows experiment and tinker with the system of your design a lot more and a lot faster, and make it more and more effective. We've seen that happen, like specifically just using assessments. State systems in India have definitely their education and our DIB performance. The biggest difference I see between the QE-IDIB SSEs, the service providers whom we assess, and those outside, is how much they use the data that we provide them. And I can only imagine that it gets so much easier now with, like I was saying, as they see the WhatsApp data coming through in terms of student engagement, of how many questions they're answering. It's almost real time that they are seeing that. And that is making them think through what is the next step. Months, right? So this has been happening in a couple of months, and they're already rethinking about design. So again, the integration, if you try to envision it, can be one, very quick in terms of the iterations. It can make it a lot quicker. It is of course cost effective, and it allows for just way more efficiencies in terms of your design of the program itself. No, not just in education, across many different sectors. It allows us to do that. Shaun, go ahead.
Maybe just some question to both of you, and kind of maybe try to also pull this back to some of our participants. Are we having, what does all this really mean for those, for outcomes-based financing contracts and results-based financing? And is this a conversation about data? Is this a conversation about measurement, or is this something that extends a little quite beyond just that? I mean, how would those of us who are listening, kind of, how should we be absorbing what we're hearing now?
I'm going to go first on that, Shaun. So outcomes-based financing is about data, Zach. I think if you don't have data, right? See, if one of the reasons why we were able to be the outcomes assessor for IDIB is because we had so much data collected over the last 5 years in terms of how education progresses, how do learning journeys progress, right? It was based off of that data that we were even able to set targets or, establish measurements. And I don't see data and outcomes-based funding as being separate, because it's an integral part of outcomes-based funding. So this conversation, at least as I'm perceiving it, is how do you make that data collection, one, more real time, second, cost effective, and possible even in this COVID time. I think those are the three things that I am trying to focus on. But does that, and Shaun, you want to add anything, or Zach, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so I think that this kind of does lead into the discussion of sort of cybernetic systems. So if we think about this as being an opportunity to really create a whole different class of outcomes-based financing. So outcomes-based financing essentially is, if in economic terms, it's a kind of game, sort of using game theoretic principles. And so how does the game change when we start to use technologies and different types of technologies? So we've seen the game changing in other industries, whether it's the airline industry or automotive industry, and we can go across many others, in the use of data that really is a lot of data, so very high resolution data, very quick feedback loops. So every airplane that you catch has a digital twin. The engines have a digital twin that's being assessed on, in real time, the data streaming, and that informs the companies kind of when the engines need to be serviced, and will do optimization of the engines and all that kind of thing. So it's now kind of almost an expected thing that you create this cyber physical connection when you have data, and when you have good data. This also allows for the feedback loops to happen. So where you can get, think of it in robotic terms, you get much kind of better feedback controllers. So you can say, a robot can operate within a certain configuration space, within a certain, can kind of move in certain ways, and then allow it to interact with the environment. So a robot like a self-driving car. And then bringing in more and more machine learning and intelligence into that, we're able to hone the decision making, so the sense and response, make that a lot more fine-tuned, and using that to measure and respond to risk. And so the question here is, can we change the game in a financing instrument? So create a digital twin of an outcomes-based financing instrument, and really change the game in this. And also, when we go beyond data just being the kind of results data that we collect as assessments, but we also look at, if we have available, real-time kind of pricing. So price incorporates a lot of information about a system that you can't even explicitly go and measure. So imagine having a number of DIBs that are all running the same interventions, but they have a real-time pricing mechanism, and you're able to compare the price across them. And so the price discovery and the price feedback loops gives you information that you may not otherwise be collecting about whether a project is running well or not. And so if we imagine this as a configuration space, so I spoke at the beginning about the configuration space in a traditional way, and Sowmya, you kind of gave a really good explanation of how long it took to configure the education DIB, a whole year-long process and so on, because it's large, because it's complex, because it involves a lot of contracting and negotiation and agreements and so on. You need to have all of the alignment up front. You need to have all aligned investors who are all agreed on the risk that's going to be taken, the quantification of that risk, the methodologies for assessment, and so on. So if we now think about more kind of cybernetic mechanisms, so we have the state space that we can configure, where we can say, all right, well, here's the fiscal space, here's the mechanisms that we can use in this space. So the fiscal space is, this is how much money we need to implement this project. The economic space says, these are the mechanisms we can use. So we can, for instance, have a continuous capital allocation, continuous capital formation process, which enables more adaptability. And we can do this with technologies using blockchain technologies and so on. You can have real-time pricing feedback, which can be adaptive to the underlying risks that are being measured and fed back from the project. And so this is something that we're engineering with using computer-aided design and robotics engineering and so on, is a risk-adjusted bonding curve. So what you see here is a bonding curve, which is essentially any project. If you describe your project, it's hopefully going to start off and then accelerate in terms of the implementation, and towards the end it kind of tails off. So most of these projects have got an S-shaped kind of curve dynamic. And if we can reflect that in the pricing, it's a bit like investing in a startup and then having rounds of funding following that. The price that you pay at the different points is going to reflect different stages of progress, or the risk that is inherent in that stage of financing. And so when we've put this back into a mechanism that's able to algorithmically determine the prices based on the underlying risk, based on the data, we can now start to have a much more adaptable and much more configurable set of mechanisms that can be linked into automated payment triggers and event-based or event-driven state changes. And this is why this data infrastructure, which is based in a stateful data infrastructure within a blockchain kind of infrastructure is so important, because you can measure what's happening in the state of the world today, and over time you can define future states. This is all in the configuration space, and so you can say, well, your outcomes payment is going to be cost plus whatever your premium is, and so on. And so the question here is really, okay, if we go this route, what is the potential to create adaptable bonds where the configuration doesn't just happen up front and then you have to hope for the best going forward? And I think we heard a lot about this in the last seminar around kind of the limited options that you have with a traditional set of instruments, which are essentially legal contracts, where you either have to just kind of default to force majeure, or you need to go through some complicated, quite difficult kind of renegotiation. Whereas if it's actually built into the mechanism that your parameters, which are your normal parameters of scope and time and cost and quality and so on, if they can be incorporated into the mechanisms that can adjust. So for instance, on the pricing side of things, so if the project is going through a change in its performance due to external factors, that can affect the pricing, which can then affect the money going in, and therefore the reserve, the payouts or the drawdowns, and the whole mechanism can kind of be made to adapt to changes, and can be made to be kind of anti-fragile or resilient. And so I think a big part of this is actually implementing smaller scale unitized outcomes-based financing instruments. So instead of having a DIB for 100,000 school kids, which is over hundreds of schools, let's rather have 100 DIBs, each with 1,000 school kids, which allows for local adaptability, allows for risk containment within each of these, and a lot more configuration options, which are based on local context and the dynamics that are kind of specific to each of those contexts. So Sowmya already mentioned that the DIB is quite a complex program, in that it has multiple different interventions, and it's implemented across different states, which have different education systems and so on. And so trying to get all of that right from a top-down perspective is really, really complicated. And then to try and change it, whilst this thing is flying, is even more complicated. And so I'm going to be a bit provocative here and sort of say, well, how do you do this? Because implementing one is difficult enough. How would you do 1,000? Well, I would say you don't. You let them implement themselves. So it's a bit like having a swarm of drones, and each drone is able to sense and respond and coordinate with the others, because it has got a set of parameters that it operates according to. And so they become more autonomous and more replicable. Now, the vision here is that we can get to a point where we've actually got the validation of these mechanisms, to the point that we can convince regulators that these are actually safe mechanisms that should be allowed, and then we really go to scale in terms of the legal and regulatory requirements around this, and the engineering those parts of the system. And so just as a sort of last comment here, this is a picture that was in a media release about a week ago from Intel, announcing that the Federal Aviation Authority has approved the commercial use of drones in this kind of automated swarm kind of way. And so I don't think it's completely impossible to envisage a scenario under which a financial authority, FSA, could say, this is an investable, issuable kind of debt financing mechanism that, in fact, we need in order to get scale and also adaptability within the context of sustainable development and the sort of post-COVID world. And we've got a pathway to that in terms of the engineering research that we're doing and the piloting and so on. So the next steps for us is to be completing the research work and implementing the pilot with Chimple and UBS Optimus Foundation on this specific one. And that's the end of my slides. So I'm gonna.
So I want to just, you touch upon, a lot to absorb there, I'm sure, for most of us here. And you touched on some very interesting things that I want to kind of challenge you and dive a little bit deeper here. And I think one of those is, I think you mentioned a key theme that's been coming out of these discussions on COVID, I think, has been the even greater need of thinking through how do these mechanisms become more cost effective, more adaptable, more flexible. You talked a little bit about risk adjusted, bonding curves and adaptive pricing. You talked a little bit about, maybe not mentioning it directly, but kind of aspects of the contractual frame and what that means of, analog contracts versus smart contracts. I know we have a few lawyers here who may have strong opinions. Also a little, what you're talking almost implies moving beyond the intermediary frame that we kind of have right now with how we think about funding, which is, and all three of those things are also part of the transaction costs and the challenges that we see with COVID-19. I think that's one question I have for you. One is ground that a little bit for us of what that really means in some of the debates, but also the vision seems great, but is this really feasible now? I mean, how far it can, if I want to move in this direction, can I do it? I mean, I'm say I'm an organization working in the field, or I'm an investor, or I'm an organization like ours that's working to kind of structure the instruments. I mean, is this really stuff that's still in the lab, or is it ready to be rolled out? I mean, how should I interpret this?
So just on the first question about, kind of how do we grasp these various things in terms of the modes of operating that we're used to, whether that's from a legal context or operational or whatever. What's really important about the design here is putting humans in the loop. So when I talk about the configuration of an alpha bond, it requires people to get around the table and figure out what are those parameters and link that to, in the same way as you would do the planning for a traditionally, but then having the tools available that you can actually simulate this. So you can parameterize the model, run simulations, and see whether this is going to, at least in the model, whether it's going to crash or whether it's going to fly under different scenarios. And it requires all of the expertise and experience of implementers and investors and intermediaries to come to that discussion. And what it allows us to do, though, is to be a lot more explicit about the stuff that we have tended to be a bit black box about. So, for instance, when we negotiate the premium on a DIB or a SIB, we're implicitly making a whole bunch of calculations about the risk. And maybe that's being negotiated and so on. But the basis for actually calculating that risk is quite black box. And it's it may not be universally so, but I would say generally we tend to just kind of overcompensate for the risk, and we just say, well, we're going to put in a 10% per annum premium or whatever the kind of standard is, rather than having some levers and having some models that can actually run the different scenarios, and so you can have a much more kind of adaptable way of doing this. In terms of like what is implementable now, so there's all of the infrastructure around the data, which is really important, because you can't run a risk-adjusted bonding curve unless you've actually got the good data coming in, and it's in the specific format, stateful data, verified, and so on. And I would say we're pretty much ready for that now. I mean, that's kind of what we're piloting together with the financing mechanism. Getting the evidence for the financing mechanism and validating the mechanism is going to be a process, but it's a process which is driven by having these models available. So we're doing a very rigorous design with engineering principles and kind of mathematical proofs and so on, and then implementing with a feedback loop into that design. So we're able to check whether our assumptions are working or not, and then adjust and feedback. Now, this is what we should be doing with any novel activity. All outcomes-based financing should have those kind of feedback loops, and I guess many do. But this just provides us with this tool set that makes it that much more formalized, I guess, and much more achievable to really measure this in a way that's not black box.
So I want to make sure we have time here for questions, but maybe before we do that, I want to also, the stuff that Shaun's saying, I mean, in many ways, it's a rethink of a lot of the way we do our work. I mean, is this something that's, are you aligned with him? I mean, or is he, in the stratosphere and it's not really aligned with kind of how you see it? I mean, what would be the big debates and that you would have, or kind of pushbacks from him?
I was going to comment on that. So I think what Shaun has is definitely a great vision, and like we've been working together trying to explore that. But one is the system piece, but then there is still the mindset piece of getting people to adopt a system like this. And I still think, despite COVID, there's still a long way to go, because first, and I'll also just talk about our experience in just getting this multi-stakeholder system to work. And I know part of Shaun's system is to not make it so complex as a stakeholder system for sure. But there was a process and there was a lot of learning that comes through that process of contracting. And I'm not sure that the dip scene is that advanced enough to get into a mode of, and again, I'm just playing devil's advocate, but my opinion, having been through that, is that it's still a little bit further away before we can actually automate it and kind of program in a few parameters and say, hey, this is the risk that we want, and this is therefore the payout. I think there is not enough experience and knowledge. While we've all done it, it's not to say that there's lack of experience, but that's not enough to kind of plug and play is what I would say. But the system has to move in that direction for sure. But I think the timeline is probably where me and Shaun disagree. I don't see this. I mean, maybe yes, COVID has accelerated some of it for sure, but I would have seen this as probably a 5-year game. I'm sure Shaun feels differently, but I think that's where we stand.
So, Shaun, I'm happy to let you react, but I definitely want to give people opportunity to ask questions. So, but maybe just to kind of wrap up, and I think, Shaun, you're a fellow traveler, and we're a big supporter of what you're trying to build. And kind of zooming out for a second, first is kind of, what does this kind of short-term roadmap really look like? I mean, help us make it more tactile. How should we even be thinking about it? And then I want to open it up after this then to the group, both for questions, but also I know a number of you will have very different visions. What Shaun and Sowmya are talking about is one platform and one way of thinking about it. There's other ways, I think it's of thinking about technology-enabled evolutions of the results-based financing model that we'd like to hear your thoughts on, and I may call on some of you to without asking questions. So, but Shaun, go ahead. Maybe it's a final thought here.
So I think there's two parts to this. The one is that when you're building these systems, you want to build them not as another big mega system. So that would be a recipe for failure, to say, okay, we're designing a whole system and building a whole system. So this is really an agile, iterative approach, and it's also an approach that uses a modular kind of a way of creating configurability and composability of different mechanisms. So the governance mechanism, the financing mechanism, the data verification mechanism. Each of these are component mechanisms that can be implemented in an iterative way and come together to form a full solution. And what that full solution looks like in different contexts for different types of projects, for different types of funders. So I think, there's a question here about, what if the outcomes funder is a government? What if it's not outcomes funding, but it's offtake contracts agreements, or if you're wanting to get into more kind of blended finance, so there's all these different variations on a theme. And what we're trying to do is find what we call the primitives, the building blocks that are composable and that can come together in a way that builds the system. And what we're trying to do in parallel with that is make sure that we're doing it with engineering rigor. So there hasn't really been that rigor in the past. I think both in financial engineering and also in a lot of software engineering. There's definitely great rigor in aeronautics engineering and robotics engineering and so on, but we don't see the same sort of discipline applied in terms of applying good principles of design, testing, validation, formalism around this. And so there's a whole bunch of research that's going on. So that's the one part of it, is the composability, and this is kind of an iterative process where you can start implementing some parts of it, collect a lot of data. As you have more data, you're able to do a lot more. The other part of it is the user interfaces. And so this is what we're spending a lot of our effort on currently, is that you don't really need to know what the engine looks like and how it works. You know, if you jump into a self-driving car, you just need to kind of know which button to push, and maybe which dashboard instruments to look at, just to get a sense of, are you going in the right direction and at the right speed? But otherwise, you kind of leave it over to the system once you've got a validated system that you can trust. And so we're putting a lot of effort on making sure that the interfaces are really, really simple. And so you can capture a lot of information through a very simple interface if it's well designed. And of course, there's a whole lot that goes on under the hood, but you don't really need to know about that.
Great. All right. Well, I want to pause for the second and open it up to questions. And while we wait, so if you have a question, please put your question into the chat, and we'll harvest them from there. And maybe while you do that, just Riley, if you want to just flash your screen here and on the where we're at with the visual note taking. Great. So as you write your questions, I want to also just call on unprompted here, our good friend Arthur Wood, who I think is still here. You know, some of the stuff we've been talking about here, Shaun, is, you know, this is one way of thinking about the evolution of the instrument, and particularly in the wake of COVID-19. And I think I would love to hear Arthur's reflections. Arthur, you and I have talked quite a bit about, you know, different, you know, the challenges, you know, inherent in this instrument, how it needs to evolve. Arthur, you were actually part of the original conceptualization of this in its early stage. And so curious, you know, any reflections listening to Shaun and Sowmya today, and any thoughts on kind of what you've been seeing with COVID-19 that you'd like to share?
Sorry, can you hear me? Do you want to give me a screen, or shall I just speak?
Yeah, please put yourself on the screen if you can.
Because the host has stopped it. There we go. I think it's with you. You won't demote. Anyhow, no worry. I think you've got to put me on Zachary, so to speak.
Yeah.
Firstly, I completely agree with what Shaun has said. 90%, I think we would be on exactly the same page. I would be, however, far more optimistic than so on. I would say this could be built inside 6 months. And the reason I say that is because I've been working with a range of organizations, 22 of them, in terms of doing exactly what you're talking about. In terms of feedback loops, there is an organization out of London that has done 3,000 projects, $1.2 billion worth of feedback loops. And that is, to your point, the generation of data in real time. It is linking. What we don't do in our marketplace is that we link to the consumers. One of the fundamental weaknesses of the whole place is that the people that pay are not the same people that consume. So Shaun, I'm completely with you in terms of the value of the data. From a finance side, it is the Reuters of the system. It makes data a real-time management tool. And secondly, you can price the security as a function of that process. It's the first element to it. The second point I think that Sowmya made is the data, is the metrics framing. The metrics framing at the moment is within its silo. And within its silo, we try to justify within that silo. What we should be looking at is what the UN Secretary General was recently called for, is the pricing of the total externalities. And what we should be measuring is the progress and the rate of progress to those externalities. That means that the financial vehicle shouldn't be how we've constructed at the moment. It should be constructed far more in a hedge fund element, which is the rate of improvement, how quickly it's happened. So if you think about the COVID context, the question everybody is asking is not what is the venture capital proposal inside inside COVID, well, a lot of people are, but in terms of the question that's been asked by the communities, how quickly can we get back to work? What they're asking is that delta of improvement. The third element behind it is that you then have to make that data competitive and comparative, so that you have a series of initiatives in one part of India, you inject them, and then you can basically identify within another region of India whether that has been effective or not. So from a governmental perspective, to pick up somebody's question, government knows exactly for each dollar it is putting in, how much incremental benefit it is buying. And then to Shaun's point, the more data you push through that process actually becomes predictive. So you create a mechanism which is marrying the metrics with the technology that is competitive, comparative, and predictive. Now, can that be done? I go and suggest you go and read the Senate intelligence report on the Russians interfering in US politics. What we're talking about here is exactly Facebook, is exactly Google, is exactly what apparently Mr. Trump didn't do with the Russians, despite the Senate Foreign Commission report, is the use of data in this particular way. And it is to create a mechanism where it becomes competitive, comparative, and predictive. To the financial tool, to then monetize it, you then need to have a tool that represents that delta of the improvement. And I don't believe, as we've had some conversations there, it is not a bond structure. And this is how I originally conceptualized the social impact bond. It should be an equity structure, because what the mirror to what is happening in metrics has been on the legal side and the financial side, that you can granularize value, you can give it legal form, and you can track it. So in terms of an outcome model, we now have the ability to identify, track, pay, and give legal form. So if you can do that, it means that you can create, driven by the types of tools that Shaun and are built, that ability to do that, which means on the metrics mechanism that it will trade as a function of the achievement of the social metric. So the market will price, based on the feedback loops to which Shaun has referred, the market will price this security, not people sitting in the middle, doing the assessment, trying to put the structure together. And the fourth element of this is the legal framework that goes with that, because, and again, Shaun touched on it, the challenge here is not whether it's blockchain, and blockchain will use the world's energy resources by 2020, so it's probably not blockchain, it's distributed ledger technology, as we all know, is how those contracts are treated for regulatory, tax, and judicial purposes. So it's not whether it's this piece of technology, so I sound slightly rude, Shaun, I didn't mean to. It's not whether it's this piece of technology or that piece of technology, because that's going to double in 18 months' time. The real issue behind that is, A, you can plug and play that technology, to Shaun's point, but secondly, you have the ability, it's a legal issue. How is that contract, that smart contract, treated for regulatory, judicial, and jurisdictional purposes? And to solve that from the financial side, you have to understand how you do that in manufacturing, but also delivery. And the final point, and I will shut up, is that also gets to the data mining, and we're working with one of the major global institutes, in fact, two of them. That data framing and the visualization of that has actually been designed and built. So I will shut up here, but to Sonia's point, this is in 5 years with political will and focus. Each one of these bits along this value chain have been built. The challenge is actually linking them together. And unfortunately, at one level, because we've gone down the route of the legal level of thinking this as a GPLP framework, sticking an intermediary in the middle of it, we've created a mechanism that is not an equity mechanism, which would allow you to group a whole range of these bonds together, to group them with a blended value structure, and to then create a financial vehicle that will then trade as a function of their collaborative behavior. The margin in here is not in let's identify the value of the incremental innovation. The real value in here is in scale and collaboration. And the real value in here, to Sonia's point, is a report that I wrote with Accenture and Brookings back 3 or 4 years ago, so it sounds egotistical, but where it was identified that for every $1 you put into education in India, you generate $50 of future economic value. Now, what has happened in impact investment is that we're arguing about what the structure of the manufacturing of these things are. the margin is going to be taken on that systemic aggregation and the margin that is taken on the outcomes. And that then also gets you to a governance issue, which is who owns this data? Where is this data lodged? Is it with a bank or a series of banks? Is that value privatized, or is it actually a public good? So I'll shut up, Zachary, I've said too much, but it's the integration of legal, social, metrics and technology. And the positive news, it's all being built, but the question is sticking it together.
Thanks, Arthur, and very much great thoughts. And maybe you give Shaun and Sowmya a quick chance to respond or any thoughts, and also challenge those of you that are listening to also challenge both Arthur, Shaun and Sowmya, and it seems we're getting more optimistic and kind of which is great, but also kind of those tough questions. But Shaun, go ahead, and then if not, also go through other questions in the chat here. But thank you, Arthur. Great thoughts.
Just gonna jump in and say, Arthur, first of all, that was a fantastic distillation of the discussion. I think it was a great summary, and I'm glad to be proven wrong, right? I think we see one of the things that we've been grappling with is that whole comparable data in education, and of course, of making for every dollar, what do you get, and that needs the comparable data. And if I'm proven wrong, I'd be the happiest person in this particular case. If it happens faster, I'm all for it. So. That's what it is. Sure.
So,
yeah,
go ahead, Shaun.
Thank you very much. It'll be interesting to see whether some of the, these ideas and also what the market is kind of demanding will, in a way, kind of overtake the work that's being done under the umbrella of outcomes-based funding. So we're beginning to see a lot of these kind of financial markets type products that are driving the capital flows into sustainable finance and all kinds of related investments, and definitely take more of the approach that you've mentioned in terms of more kind of hedge fund type approaches, portfolio approaches, kind of where you can get a better kind of design of the risk portfolio, as well as address a kind of more integrated approach to linking this to underlying other economic activities. So if you're a traditional manufacturing company, then also building in products around that help to hedge the environmental risks and social risks and sustainable development risks. And ambitions. So yeah, I completely concur with you.
So we have a question here from Kun Peng. I'm not sure which organization, but they're asking, in order to implement these types of frontier technologies, what's the tech solution? What's the cost? Do these have to be customized to each? I know we're talking a little bit beyond transactions, but kind of to each project. But Kun, if you're there, maybe you can quickly ask.
So I'm happy to just jump in here and just come to the point that these technologies are predominantly open source technologies. I mean, everything ICSO has built is open source. And in terms of the data ownership and the use of the data, are very much kind of based on sovereignty. So you own your own data, and the mechanisms that we're creating are for a commons marketplace rather than privatization of the data. And so in terms, and the other part of this is that there is a public infrastructure which is underpinning all of this, and that is a distributed ledger infrastructure which shares the costs of running the kind of core data infrastructure amongst many people. So the equivalent is the internet. So the internet allows us to do a whole lot for free and to innovate wildly on top of it. And what we're really building here is a next iteration of the internet with a sustainability purpose.
So the next question is from Ashishni Shah.
Could I have an input on that?
Yeah, possible? Real quick, but quick.
all this technology is built. So, and is prepared to be white labeled and can be done at relatively low cost. So to your question, it's plumbing, okay? It's white labelable plumbing that can be plugged and played according to what people want. So it is all built, it's all up and running. If anybody wants to come to me, I'm happy to demonstrate any of, it's not my system, it's a whole other range of folks' system. But the reality is it's all built. And the issue is actually just plugging and playing it together around the issue.
So I want to, on that note, I want to invite Ashishni Shah, who's asking how large of the data set do you need to realistically have before this approach to analysis, learning, predictive modeling, becomes actually appropriate? Ashishni, are you there? Maybe you can just ask your question directly or thoughts. Maybe we can just answer it. I mean, any thoughts on kind of the size of the data to actually for this to be functional? I mean, given that we're sometimes talking about very bespoke, tiny projects, that maybe is it functional at that scale? Education is a different animal, but sometimes other sectors don't have that richness of data.
Yeah, I guess I'll jump in here. So what these systems are designed for is to take what is currently being done and enable it with the technology. So for an individual project, even if your project is only making 5 claims, the way that those claims are made, and 5 as in 5 events, so 5 assessments and 5 data points, the way that you capture that and feed that into the system together with private beliefs and so on is very different to the way that it's done traditionally. So traditionally, you have data in different systems. You don't have the data on the same ledger. Whereas now we're bringing together the financial ledger and the performance ledger into the same system. And so in terms of being able to create a mechanic around that, you only need one data point to trigger a state change if that's all you've got available. But when you start to collect the data in a standardized format, and so we are very much driven by the semantic standards of semantic schemas, public schemas, open standards, and so the data becomes aggregable across multiple projects. And with the cryptography, we can start to do that in ways that are still privacy preserving. So you can learn from the data without having to have a big aggregation and without having some central kind of data owner or data aggregator. And I think this also kind of speaks to the importance of the whole architecture of this infrastructure, is that if you really want to get mass adoption, you need to be able to give people the sovereignty of their data, the guarantees that the privacy will be respected, and so on. Otherwise, it really becomes a play of kind of one big data aggregator against another, and people are expecting that, okay, are you going to be the Facebook of impact, and nobody wants that. So I kind of answered a couple of things there in the same set of statements and responses, but yeah, so it's a continuum, and hopefully we get smarter as we have more data, and if we do it in the right kind of ways. So small data is important. It can become big data.
So I'll jump to the next question here in a second, but also I know we have several lawyers here that are listening in, and I want to invite, push, encourage them, to share any thoughts, comments, ideas, pushback on anything they've heard today, and see, is there a legal angle and relevance to any of this discussion today? And for those of you who are lawyers listening in, please jump in, raise your hand. But while we do that, I think we have a question here from Malala from ACRUX, who's asking about what does this mean for working with governments as a procurement agent? And Malala, maybe if you're still listening, feel free to ask the panel directly.
Thank you, Zach. Yeah, the question was mainly directed to Shaun. I find the initiative extremely interesting, and I think it is definitely the way forward for SIPs and for advancing the market of outcome payment and other impact investment instruments worldwide. But especially in nascent markets, when the outcome payer is a government, it is extremely difficult to change the letter of the contract. So if we have a contract that adapts itself as needed, how do we deal with the contractual side? Because in the SIP that we are managing in Argentina and others that we're structuring, it would be extremely difficult to couple what you're proposing with what the contractual constraints are.
Yeah, so I think it's important to clarify what in the mechanism is adaptable or it can be changed. So, you know, if your outcomes contracts are quite set in stone, if they're done in a way where you can have conditions very clearly laid out, so kind of levels of achievement linked to levels of reward, that can be programmed into the system. And really then what we're looking at is the adaptability of the money coming in and how that money gets spent. So pricing the capital as it comes into the instrument. And we use the term bond, and Arthur, I completely concur with you that we need some ontological kind of innovation around here. It comes into the instrument and can adapt to the risks that are being experienced through those feedback loops. It doesn't necessarily have to adjust the outcomes payment. The outcomes payment could be defined in terms of bands of achievement, for instance, and the system can be configured towards that. And then in terms of actually interfacing with the digital technology, from what I understand, in many cases, the government as payer may work with a technical agency or an intermediary in the context of an outcomes-based project. And so, you know, there's also potential ways there of creating agency kind of roles in the system.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think it is, so long as you're not touching the outcome payment per se, maybe there's a way of factoring this into the contractual, or the letter of the contract, better said.
Yeah.
So before we wrap up, you know, want to take one last indulge and see if any of the lawyers out there have any thoughts. Give you guys a minute, and then we can maybe talk a little bit about kind of what comes next. But are there any lawyers I can coax into get into the hot seat? I'll take the silence as a no. But
Can I say something? Because we work with 5 former regulators, and we passed legislation in the United States back in 2007, and it's been integrated into the program-related investment code. We're working with the late Stephen Lloyd, who the Brits on the phone may know. So I have a legal opinion from Stephen, one of the last things he did before he very sadly died, as to how this legal framework would work in the United Kingdom. And in fact, it is based on a global legal framework that integrates into the relevant tax and subsidy codes. So the legal framework has also been designed and integrated also with the former Deputy Controller of Currency in the United States into a financial framework. So I won't bore people with here, but I'm happy to chat to anybody if they're interested. Sure.
I'm sure that the idiosyncrasies of that will vary, you know, dramatically at a country level, and given the
well, it allows you to look at it. The key point, Zachary, is it allows you to look at it as a systems issue.
Fair enough.
Systems issues, and if you can look at a systems issue, it changes the fun.
So I want to invite any last words from the panel, but also zoom out for a second here before we close here, in that I think based on these past three webinars, we start off hearing a little bit about some of the challenges and ways different projects are adapting. Today we've moved a little bit towards looking forward and what does technology and technology-enabled solutions look like, and could that mean for evolving these instruments and say future-proofing and making these types of financing mechanisms more resilient, or able to support more resilient, societies. Going forward, we'll be reaching out to everybody with some more options around what this could look like. It could, there's been on the table and some interest from a number of you on working together on different task forces, which we'll be sending out some more information on, as well as potentially some interest, if there's demand, for doing more of these kind of webinar discussions. But I think, pointed back to also this discussion here, it's definitely something that's very close to home for us too, and that we're very keen to push and promote this kind of frontier thinking around what is it that we're trying to get from these outcomes-based financing mechanisms, but how do we evolve it? And so a question to maybe the panel is, how could this community accelerate this kind of discussion to get to where, Arthur's ambition of, having something rolled out in 6 months? I mean, what would this be a topic to put on the table for several different organizations to maybe collaborate on and kind of try to drive? I mean, this is a question for the panel. Is this community a forum for that?
My first thoughts are, I think, essentially to think through what is needed right now. I think there are a lot of different thoughts, but no kind of a synthesis of thoughts in terms of how, whether it is going through this system or how to manage the different things that we have to do in recontracting, like just talking about our resetting targets, right? And there are a lot of things that go into resetting targets. And there's many questions. That's just one question that we're facing right now. But a synthesis of thoughts from different players within the DIB would be useful to have in terms of how are they acting in terms of the contractual, whether it is targets, whether it's outcomes funding, just to synthesize some of the decisions that have been made or close to making those decisions. I think would be very valuable for other DIBs to come and learn from, basically.
Shaun, any final thoughts?
Yeah, so at times like this, we see the greatest innovation because of the sort of selective pressure and need to innovate. And so the question would really be, okay, so what are the platforms that we want to innovate on? Are they yesterday's platforms or are they tomorrow's platforms? And then part of the innovation is not just about, okay, well, which technology do we use and so on, but it's also about the innovation of meaning. In fact, the greatest innovation is innovation of meaning. So when we talk about outcomes-based finance, we talk about bonds in inverted commas, to Arthur's point, really kind of rethinking what do we mean by that. So to Arthur's point about looking at externalities and pricing in externalities and creating market mechanisms for that. Now is the time to really do this. And I think that the role of this community should be to foster innovation, so to become an innovation community. And I think there are, some good examples of innovation communities. It's really about information sharing, and it's about providing some seeds for the innovation and some capabilities for the innovation. But definitely, if that innovation is going to happen, it's going to happen amongst a network of practitioners and people who have been working on these issues and have been innovating, but now can take the next kind of leap forward.
Great thoughts. And I'm going to break my own rule of keeping the time, but I know Jonathan from USAID here, who's from their legal team, and he's agreed to kind of step onto the hot seat real quick as some final reflections, and then we can wrap up.
Great, thanks, Zach. Thanks, Zach. I feel like you were baiting me and others who are lawyers. So just quickly though, as an attorney for USAID, I wanted to kind of piggyback off some of these really insightful comments. I wondered, I'd pose the question to this group, especially, is it necessarily too late to consider, challenging the name impact bond, and if there's room to even consider re-envisioning what it should be called, so that it more aptly describes not only how these structures are currently, but also what we want them to become. As Arthur was also hinting or driving the point of, this should be more equity focused, not, and these aren't even debt instruments to begin with. These aren't even instruments, these are structures. So I wondered to what extent we as this group have the opportunity to reclaim and re-envision what that term is, so that we're not having to apologize and say, you know, this isn't actually a bond, and then we're getting in our own ways. And then the second, from a legal perspective, is kind of back to revisit the issue of what is the role of contracts here. And then I feel like ultimately these are really driven as relationships, not as pure transactions. And I think we see contracts as a transaction, insofar as if you don't fulfill a certain payment, then we will legally enforce against you. I don't think that's necessarily true in most contexts, especially in the development space, where we're talking about relationship capital. And so I feel like the purpose of a contract can play a powerful role in how it designs structuring partnerships and conversations. So it's really about the governance, not so much the pure enforceability in a legal sense, but really trying to define the relationships within the structure itself. And so re-envisioning how we do more thoughtful dispute resolution so that we mitigate or even prevent disputes from happening in the first place. And so that's something we're actually going to take back as a result of these webinars within USAID and discuss how might we develop principles for thoughtful dispute resolution in our grants that inform our outcome payments as an outcome funder. So I think those are some ripe areas for discussion, at least from a legal perspective. Thanks.
Thanks, Jonathan. Very, very thoughtful comments. Quite good and a good way to end. I think, you know, I'd like to thank all of you who asked questions and participated, and definitely thank, you know, Shaun and Sowmya for the incredibly enriching conversation. It's, you know, been great fun. We'll be reaching out to all of you who have been participating over the past few weeks with next steps, and think about how do we, you know, what makes sense and what appetite there is to start to bring all these kind of very juicy nodes of conversation into something more meaningful, and where and how can we drill down to actually take it from important ideas into how we can collectively move these things forward in a meaningful way. It's, you know, for the way we see COVID is it's permission to change. And so it's this opportunity. So let's harness it. Thank you again to everyone. Christina, any graphic we can show as we end here on either the mentee pool or the visual notes. Thanks again, everyone. Have a good weekend.
Thanks, everyone.